Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So recently, I've been on Twitter in the Twitter sphere around a lot of personality typology enthusiasts. And I've been on YouTube, looking at a lot of different YouTube channels. And, in the past year or so, we've done many meetups, many live events, different events with a lot of different people around personal growth and the typology community. And I've noticed a lot of people would love to be involved in things that Antonia and I do here at Personality Hacker, creating podcasts, creating media, videos, maybe online courses, maybe even speaking at events, writing. And as I see a lot of young people, a lot of people even my own age or even older than me, getting into creating online and in the world, I noticed that some of them do really well at what they do. Some of the YouTube videos that come out are really funny and creative. Some of them have really good advice. And sometimes some people struggle with how to create media or to put themselves out in the world in a way that resonates with people. So on today's podcast, one thing that we thought we could do is talk a little bit about how you, in your life, whether it's personality types or another topic that you're interested in, could create media and become an influencer around the thing you're passionate about, and how to maybe turn that into, or at least begin thinking about how to turn that into value creation for yourself. So maybe it could become a career or something you sell your services around or develop some type of value exchange for. And we're going to give some practical thoughts and advice in this podcast to help you if this is something that you're interested in doing in your life.
Yeah, and it's not just for people who are in the typology world. There's a lot of people who would like to be able to be an influencer or content creator in order to make their living doing that. So we're going to talk about it from the perspective that we're most familiar with, which is doing it in this, in this world or in this niche. I think that these principles could apply to basically any niche that you as the listener, if this is what you want to do with your life, then grab whatever we're saying and apply it to the thing that you're passionate about.
It's kind of on the public consciousness right now. Everybody is online, and there's a lot of people that want to be influencers. I see advertisements all the time for, do you want to be an influencer on Instagram? Download my course, and I'll teach you the 7 steps to travel the world and have fun and take pictures and post them on Instagram and become wildly successful like I did. I see these ads popping up a lot, and I see a lot of people that are attempting to generate content online, and sometimes they struggle with, what content do I have to generate? From anywhere from the stuff my kids watch. And we talked about, the stuff my kids watch, there's like these people that have YouTube channels completely around building paper towel forts in Walmarts, right? They videotape like long videos of them sneaking into a Walmart, building a paper towel fort, and then spending the night or maybe multiple days in a Walmart shelving unit as the content for their channel. So there's a lot of channels and a lot of people that want content. Our daughter watches something online where these kids play with baby dolls, basically, like dolls and like Barbie dolls and baby dolls and different toys, and create little narratives and stories around it. She watches these, then she goes off and plays with her own toys. And these are really interesting pieces of content that are unique and creative online. But I do know that it looks like people are struggling. How do I create something? What do I talk about? Where does the content come from? We had a long video conversation. We'll probably link to it somewhere in the description here for this podcast with our friend Denzel, who was actually on the show a few weeks ago. He posted this to his channel. He interviewed Antonia and myself for probably about an hour around what it takes to be an influencer. How do you become an influencer? What does it look like to create content? I think it was a very valuable conversation that prompted us to say, why don't we record a podcast about this as well and talk to you about some of the things you might be able to do for your channel or your outlets, your media that you're creating.
I think this is also important because, what came up for me conceptually is the idea that was definitely burgeoning in last century, which was this idea of going, like the majority of people were going from laborers to knowledge workers. More people were working in offices than they were in industrial careers. And I think what we're seeing, because the technology has allowed for it, is that it's not just knowledge work now, it's like creative work. It's like basically the same thing as working in a cubicle or a day job is now shifting into being influencers online and sharing ideas with each other. So I think that this is not just a burgeoning industry with people who want to like quote unquote work from home. I think this is actually one of the ways that the majority of people are going to be, employed and not necessarily hired by big businesses. It's almost like in fact, I think it was a podcast I was listening to with Naval Ravikant, who mentioned that his perspective or his sort of pattern recognition is that everybody's going to be their own little corporation or company. And most people are going to be hiring themselves out as individuals. So mastering this concept of being able to get attention and to be able to articulate well, to be creative, even if you are a laborer, right? And there's literally nothing wrong with that. In fact, the world needs laborers. I look around at the institutions and the infrastructure in the world, or at least in the Western world in America. I guess those two things are not the same, but in America, which is where I'm at in the Western world, I'm noticing that there's a lot of our infrastructure needs attending to. And so there's great need for people who are doing things like maintaining our infrastructure. And I suspect that there's going to be a time period that basically everybody will become a contractor. And so it's just kind of an interesting idea to see people heading that direction. So regardless of whether or not you are a knowledge worker or creative worker, or you're somebody who is a laborer, I still feel like these principles are going to start applying to gaining attention, to marketing oneself and advertising, being able to create content that illustrates what you're capable of beyond just a resume, because I think resumes are functionally, the system never really worked that well to begin with. And now people are realizing that they have to be a lot more creative in their resumes, a lot more creative with how they get attention. So I think even if you're not a person who wants to be an influencer or a knowledge worker, maybe some of these principles can still apply if you're trying to get attention for the kind of job that you do, regardless of whether or not you're a contractor. I just think that these are sort of generally good principles for everybody to absorb in order to get a leg up in a burgeoning world.
Yeah, and you bring this idea up of knowledge workers. Peter Drucker, I think, is a really good author to read about knowledge work. So we talk about physical labor, creating physical goods and services in maybe the agrarian and industrial age, where you're producing food or crops as the work you do. And then you maybe have factory work, creating widgets as the work you do. And then in the 20th century, we shift to knowledge work, which is intellectual. It's moving, instead of physical goods and services, it's moving ones and zeros or words around. It's, managing information, and information management becomes something that's powerful in the last century. Well, that's actually evolved now into narrative casting roles. So this idea of creative, every filmmaker, every YouTube star, every social media influencer is casting a narrative into the world. And that's coinciding with the breakdown of modernism into postmodernism. So there's no longer a meta framework. There's no longer in this country here in the United States, it was a Judeo-Christian framework that was the meta frame. And everything kind of fell in underneath that. Well, those have all broken apart, those meta frameworks, communism versus capitalism, these giant meta frameworks. Some people still try to hold on to them, but they're breaking down rapidly. And with the advent of the internet now, people are able to group into subcultures and smaller groupings of ideas and philosophies and religions and cults and all these different things. And narrative casting through creative means has become so much more democratized and also so much more readily available that I would assume most young people believe that that's going to be their role in the world, is to cast narratives. Whereas during the Industrial Revolution and even the Information Revolution of the last century or two, there were very few narrative casters. You had some of the big media and filmmakers and radio stars and people like that talking, and some authors, but the economics of scale were there, or the economics were such that it was difficult to be a narrative caster. You had to earn the right to be there. You didn't have platforms like YouTube and Instagram and things of this nature. So we're moving into a very postmodern narrative casting framework in the future as we move forward.
And that's where the competition is. Our competition is in whose narrative can outdo everybody else's narrative. That you can see that. Like, that's the war. That is the war that's happening right now, is the war of narratives. And what's interesting is you just built on that concept of going from like agrarian to widget making to knowledge work, and then now we're in a creative space. But every single one of those things has been built on the previous, and the previous has had to integrate the thing that gets built on top of it. So what I mean by that is, it used to be that you were just an industrial worker, perhaps, or maybe you were doing something that was that was effectively almost 100% labor. And then when knowledge work came around and that was an explosion, the laborers needed to incorporate more knowledge work into what they were doing as laborers, meaning that like there was a time period when I used to sell and do tech support for GPS equipment for big companies. And, you know, like big companies like Caterpillar that sell these agricultural tools like, you know, motor graders and those kinds of things, excavators, etc. And there was a point where you couldn't just be an excavator operator. You had to also understand now all of this complex GPS and laser equipment in order to run the excavator, because the equipment got to a point where it made their lives a million times easier, and their degrees of accuracy were like way, way, way higher. But you couldn't just operate the excavator. You couldn't just operate the motor grader. You had to now understand how the little black box worked and how it like connected to all of the equipment, all the sophisticated equipment now. And it wasn't that hard, but you couldn't just, in some ways it made the job more automated, but in other ways you had to incorporate an understanding of that knowledge, right? And you had to, in part, be a little bit of a knowledge worker while you were a laborer. And most laborer jobs required that. It required you to be more and more of a knowledge worker and a laborer at the same time. And the assumption is that it's going to keep going. The assumption is that as a knowledge worker, you're not going to be able to just be a knowledge worker. You're also going to have to incorporate more of this creative work into your knowledge work, just like you had to incorporate knowledge work into your laborer work. And so having a mastery of how the creative world works and how the creative world requires people to move within that, within that culture is going to be required for people on down the line. I wouldn't be surprised if laborers are also going to have to become more creative. And you can see that. You can see just in getting a job with a company, you have to somehow stand out. And, people complain about this all the time. And I think they complain about it. It makes sense that they complain about it, which is that they'll send out a ton of different resumes and they won't get any response back, right? Like they don't even get like a call that says, hey, we're not hiring you. And oftentimes the reason why is because the company got 100 applications and they're just not going to go through 99 of them to say that we chose somebody else. And so you just don't hear anything. So it kind of doesn't matter what the job is. People are realizing that they have to stand out in those applications in order to get a response back. So now people are doing things like sending, YouTube videos as their resume or CV. They're doing little creative things in the resumes in order to get attention. And they're noticing that when they get attention, they don't have to have that ridiculous requirement of be a young, fresh person that we don't have to pay very much to, but you also have to have a decade worth of experience and, a master's degree in order to get this, this job that doesn't really require a master's degree, but all these ridiculous requirements in order to get a job. And in order to sort of cut through all of that noise, people have to be more creative in how they present themselves to those employers. So it kind of doesn't matter whether or not you want to be an influencer. It kind of doesn't matter whether or not you want to be a person whose job it is to create and spin narratives. You have to get good at spinning narratives in order to spin the narrative of you want to hire me. And so that's the game that pretty much everybody in the modern world is right now having to catch up to play. So again, some of the things we're about to talk about, I think, fold into it's applicable to maybe everybody, even people who don't necessarily want to be influencers.
When we talk about creative endeavors, so we talk about coming and having a narrative casting framework or creation framework, the easiest place to see this is in entertainment. So we see people that want to create media that's entertaining. And often when we talk about influencers online, we're talking about someone who's focused on entertainment. Hey, here's the country I visited. Here's the food I ate. Here's the exciting activity I did. Here's the cliff I'm hanging off the side of to get the picture over the ocean. isn't this cool? Isn't this entertaining what I'm doing in my life and all the things that are happening? And entertainment's the easiest one for everyone to see. And a lot of young people in particular go, man, that looks fun. I get to go live an exciting life and be entertaining and get value exchange for that, get paid for that, or make that into a business, being an influencer, being a narrative, creative narrative caster. The next level up from that, I think, is motivation. That's the next obvious one for people, which is, oh, I need to get votes for this political candidate, or I need somebody to do something or take an action or come out for this cause. And so they create media to stir people up and motivate them for action. That's another thing that I think creative narrative casting media can be done. And we see a lot of friction points there. There's not a lot of friction points around entertainment unless the motivators that are creating motivating media go, wait a second, you said something in your movie that was wrong. Now I'm going to get at you for that. So sometimes you can even see categorical wars where you've got people with a certain narrative they want to cast forward, a political or social or religious narrative, and they get on the entertainment person's case. Maybe a comedian or somebody else is trying to provide entertainment. They come and attack them. So there's already friction points there. And that's the next level, I think, that's pretty obvious for people around, beyond just entertainment, it's the motivation. I think the next level up, and this is something that, we're involved in with it when it comes to narrative casting and creativity, is education. So you've got the masterclass online where these famous Hollywood movie stars or actors or writers and authors are teaching people how to do what they do. And they're teaching something online. They're educating how to do things or giving information out. I think that's something else that's pretty obvious for people. Most people, I think, though, the barrier of entry is the higher up you go in those three little levels, the harder it gets. And there might be other narrative casts and things of this nature as well that I'm not thinking of in my little 3-part framework here. But it's easy to do entertainment because it doesn't take much skill necessarily. I mean, it's skilled, but to be entertaining, a kid that does something silly and falls down on the ground, you film it and put it on YouTube, that can be entertaining. It didn't take much skill for that. It was just catching a human doing something human that was entertaining for a moment. And then it can be very highly skilled, like movies or, music, things that are very crafted and carefully constructed. They can also be very skilled. But it seems like that's what it's fun. There's a lot of fame and fortune that comes with it. A lot of people want to create music, and there's an opportunity now to be entertaining. The platforms are there. You've got SoundCloud for music. You've got YouTube for filmmaking and video. You've got iTunes for podcasting. There's an opportunity for you to be entertaining and reach a wide audience, which is really cool.
Well, to be fair, with entertainment, the higher up you go in exposure and in success, the more chops it takes. So entertainment doesn't feel like it requires a lot at a low grade because things very simple can go viral. But the better a person is doing in that world, the more the chops they need in order to get there.
Yes. Motivation is probably where a lot of the money is right now in creation. If you are, somebody that has a political viewpoint and you can put that out and get advertisers around it or people to support your cause, or help a political candidate, just be hired by somebody, or help a social cause, or help a religious-based something. Motivation, talking about, the religion that you're into and really putting that forth. There's probably a lot of opportunity there to make actual revenue from that because it's anytime you're motivating people to action, that's basically a sales transaction, right? You're motivating them to, quote unquote, make the sale or buy the product or do the service or whatever it is. So motivation, or pull the lever for the candidate.
Click the link,
whatever it is. Yeah. So that's something that motivation's really lucrative at this point. It does take a little higher degree of skill, though, more than entertainment, because you have to know how to craft messages that get people to take action.
And pierce through all the noise.
Absolutely.
Because activism right now and this motivational component of the media, the non-entertainment form of the media, is a very chaotic, noisy world. And so, again, just like with entertainment, the better a person is doing, the more successful they are, the higher the degree of savvy and chops you have to have.
Absolutely. And then probably the most lucrative of all of them, of those three categories, is education. Weirdly enough, not education necessarily in information, but advice education, how to do something, coaching, helping people do something that outputs, on a meta level. All three of them can be valuable, but education takes the highest degree of calibration for you because if you're going to give people advice, not just to take an action and not just to entertain them, you're going to tell them, here's how you can live a better life. Here's how you get in shape. Here's how you build wealth online. Here's how you get into real estate. Here's how what I'm doing right now, we're talking about right now, teaching you a little bit about being an influencer and how to do stuff online. You kind of have to have some experience and know what you're talking about. You can't just go from the hip. You have to be able to tell people, hey, this works. This is a path to X result. And so education, I think, can be highly lucrative and there's a lot of value exchange there because it's helping people do something they want to do in their life, which is really, really powerful. So it's helping them become have mastery over themselves to output something they want. Now, if you can blend all three of these together, you want to talk about powerful, influencing, creative narrative casting. If you take a education framework of experience, something that you know how to do and teach other people how to do, and you layer in the ability to get them motivated to go take that action, to actually do it, and you can make it entertaining, well, now you probably are unstoppable in what you're doing. If you can blend all three of those together, that is the sweet spot of being able to really affect change, create a powerful narrative, and put your ripple or drop in the universe of something that you want to put out into the world. So just coming from that framework or that perspective, I think, is important to know where you're at in those three levels. Are you more entertainment focused? Are you more motivational focused? Are you more education focused? And then if you can blend all three, I think that is very, 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 very powerful for an influencer. So let's get into some specifics. I did write some notes for this podcast. Very rare for us to write notes down. We usually just wing it, but I do have some notes here, and I've basically divided this into three broad categories of learn, create, and broadcast. So we're, again, talking about being a creative narrative casting influencer, keeping in mind those three categories. You're going to go through a process, no matter which of those categories, or if you're blended with all of them, you're going to go through a basic process of three phases: the learning phase, the creation phase, and the broadcast phase, or the distribution phase. So let's talk a little bit about learning. Obviously, before you can cast narratives into the world as an influencer, as somebody that wants to create something that goes out there, you have to know what you're doing. You have to have some kind of learning, some kind of, at least this is my opinion, have to have some kind of an input that allows you to speak about things with authority, knowing what you're talking about. Or even if it's just entertainment, I think we should probably not talk too much about the entertainment factor. I think that I'd like to talk more about the motivation and particularly the education factor, because that's where our passion is, right? But you have to think in terms of motivation and entertainment as well. But I think in the back of my head, at least, Antonia, I don't know about you, but as I talk about this, I think of people that want to help educate or put forth philosophy or ideas in the world of having people think differently and then motivating them to think differently. And then the entertainment's kind of a given as far as I'm concerned. And we'll talk a little bit about that too during the creation part. When we're thinking about the beginning stages, learning and kind of knowing what we're going to talk about as an influencer, so whatever the topic is, I think a key principle here is advice is greater than information. So information, it's my opinion, I don't know how you feel about this, Antonia, but it's my opinion, information should be free. Freely available and free. I think Wikipedia, I love Wikipedia. I love the internet. Information, for me to find information and to engage with information and access information, I believe should be free. Now, depending, I mean, it's obviously not free. I have to have an internet connection. I have to do the work to go get that information. Sometimes, like when our book was released, I bought a list of all the Barnes and Noble stores in the United States. That information was free on their website if I did a bunch of searches and tried to hodgepodge it together. But I paid for a list of all the bookstores in the United States so I could call and make sure our book was in all the bookstores. I wanted that list, so I paid for that information. Even though I believe it should be free, someone went to the time and effort to assemble that information and made it easy for me to access rather than having to go do it on my own. So even though I think information should be free, there are times when I do pay for information. I think it's totally valuable to charge for and to have value exchange around some types of information.
Well, and in what you're talking about there, somebody compiling it, isn't the information wasn't not free. It was the labor of compiling it.
Correct. That
you were paying for. I don't know if I would say information should be free. I just know it is. Like, that's just the modern world. In the modern world, information is free, or so available that it might as well be free. Like Wikipedia, even for them, on every year, they let people know that in order for Wikipedia to continue to exist, a small donation is requested if you use Wikipedia, which I always donate every year. But it's effectively free. If I didn't donate, somebody else would donate, and I doubt Wikipedia would die. So it's not necessarily that information, at least from my perspective, it's not like it should be. It's that it is effectively free at this point. And so, or at least so inexpensive that it's readily available. Like, I don't really have to, it's not like, it's not taking a chunk out of my, out of my paycheck.
Yeah. But I would say applied information and advice. I mean, I guess I understand what you mean by the should statement. I don't know if it should or shouldn't. Maybe I overreach by saying it should be free. But I do think applied information and advice is something that somebody put a lot of work into curating or developing or experiencing. And I believe that can be value exchanged without any question. Like, that's something that I think is really totally appropriate. And you can see this in what we do here at Personality Hacker. When you take our online test, we give you information about your personality type for free after you take the test. And if you want advice on how to grow as a person or apply that information, the application of information, that's where we ask for a value exchange. And we give a lot away for free. I mean, this podcast we've never charged for. Up till now, we've never had sponsorships. Just almost, at the time of this recording, almost 300 episodes over the course of almost 6 years. We've just given away a ton of information for free to help people, and even advice and applied information, quite frankly, because we know that the more we do that, the more value add we're going to give. But I would say that the key is experience, advice, and applied information. I hear so many people, influencers or people that want to be influencers, say, well, I read this piece of information, and they start spouting things they've read, thinking that's value, when I would argue that your experience in the world and information you've heard and applying it toward helping people is so much more powerful and has so much more value behind it than just talking about something you read or heard somewhere or your random opinions about things. Your opinions are not very valuable. Now, advice includes opinions, but often those opinions are based on some type of experience or learning or understanding. One of the things we did in the early days is we did a lot of coaching here at Personality Hacker to develop some of the concepts and key things that we talk about. So the advice comes from experience of helping people one-to-one work through their issues. And let's say we're talking to an INTJ and we help them work through their issues. Now we take that experience of helping an INTJ actually execute on something in their life, make their life better, and we say, oh, we could turn this into advice for INTJs in general, and then we can have value exchange for that. So applied information and advice is, in my opinion, again, is always better than just information and opinion. I think those things can be valuable to some degree, but the limit of being able to turn that into some value exchange is going to be, there's going to be a limit to that, I should say.
And this is built on the concept of, and we've done podcasts on it, on the model of DIKW, data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And when you get to the advice level, you're not just talking about information or even knowledge. You're talking about wisdom. It's wisdom that has come from time and experience and having basically done the legwork to get through something. It's basically it's cartography. It's creating a map for other people so that they don't have to go through all the, the hacking of the 6-foot tall grass to find the trail. Like, you've already created the trail and here's the map to get to the trail. And so the map isn't free because the map wasn't free for you. Like, you had to put all this time, labor, all of this resource into creating that map, and so you charge for the map. And I think that's basically what the advice piece is. It's somebody else has done the job of cartography, and they're giving you a map. I think what you're talking about with this idea of opinion, or I've read something somewhere, I think one of the challenges with that is that it kind of doesn't matter what you think. Like, none of us, it really matters what we think. It only matters the value that we can give to other people. And sometimes people are fascinated by our opinions. And so sometimes people will pay for the privilege of listening to our opinions. But it's very rarely that you build that relationship with an audience 100% on the things you've read someplace else. Because people can go read those things someplace else themselves. It's usually because you've woven in enough wisdom. You've woven in enough of your personal take. And people can sort of hear that resonance of, yeah, I think this person has figured some stuff out. I think that they've I think that they've gone through some of this themselves. They've applied this knowledge, and so now they come from a position of wisdom. And that's usually why people are attracted to influencers. So, like, what we think only really matters to us, how we've applied all of this information and how we've turned it into something that generates a more successful life, that's almost always what attracts people.
You're listening here, and you might be saying, Joel and Antonia, are you saying that me as a burgeoning influencer that wants to start talking on camera or on microphone or writing, are you saying I need to go get experience and connect some real world learning and reference points before I can come and just talk about the things I know and the things I think? In some ways, yes, that's what we're saying. I think in some ways we're saying, yes, experience is important. Reference experiences are important. It doesn't mean you can't start to curate and experiment with some of your ideas and opinions and concepts. That's very appropriate to crowdsource some of your learning, but realize that that's where you are. In the three categories of learning, creating, and broadcasting, if you're out there without any experience on Twitter and you're talking about personality types, for example, and you've never coached around personality types, you've read a couple books, you have some theories, and you're saying this is how this cognitive function works, and this is what my opinion is, I am saying that is less valuable than someone who has experienced coaching someone around using that cognitive function. I am saying that. And that's a very polarizing, potentially divisive thing to say. Not divisive, but polarizing thing to say. But that's kind of how I see it. So you're in a learning frame right now. You're trying to learn and get the experience and reference points to be able to speak with authority when you actually create.
Well, to piggyback on that and make it like maybe 1 degree clearer, you don't have to do that if you just want to kick on a camera and talk and upload your YouTube video. But if you want to get to a place where you're actually building your career out of this, if you're asking for value exchange, if you request from your audience to subsidize you and your creation, then yeah, you're going to have to give something of value. And most people don't just value curated information, because information is, like we said, regardless of whether or not it should be, it is free, effectively. For anybody who doesn't want to have to pay for it, it's free. It's available out there. So that level of getting to wisdom, that level of getting to the place where you can give people solid advice, it's not that you have to do that in order to kick on a camera and create content. You don't have to do that.
Great point.
But if you're going to start requesting value exchange, you're probably going to need to.
Or thinking about that in the future, something you want to do, value exchange wise in the future. It's reference experiences, advice, experience, like all these things are going to make you valuable in the narratives you cast out there into the world.
And in a really crowded space, you're probably going to need it in order to grow. And not that the typology world is particularly crowded. It's actually a pretty small pond, and there's really not that many fish in this pond. I mean, there's a lot of people talking about type, but it's not exploded. It's not like everywhere. And so right now is actually a pretty good time to start thinking about these kinds of things if this is the industry or the way you want to go, because it's still weirdly enough pretty small. And so, but it will get more and more crowded over time. It's just because it's growing. Like this is not diminishing. This whole niche is not getting smaller. It's not diminishing. It's only growing. And so because of that, if you want to enter this pool, then becoming a voice of reason, becoming a voice of advice, a voice of wisdom, those are going to be the things that will become more and more valuable, not just the technical aspects of it, but the actual life application aspects. And so going that direction is going to cut through the noise of a niche that's getting bigger and bigger all the time.
I'm an iconoclast, by the way. I kind of pivoting here, I think by what you said is really good, Antonia. I understand the sentiment of seeing the dinosaurs that are here in the world, like whatever industry or whatever thing you're interested in that you want to cast narratives around. Nothing new is under the sun. Someone has been talking about what you want to talk about in some iteration before you come along to talk about it. Same thing here. Antonia and myself are obviously not the first two people to talk about personality types and talk about personal growth. Now, we are weaving those two together, and that might be a unique take on it. But even that isn't that unique. People have been weaving together personal growth and typology for a long time. So there are things that have come before. And when I see the things that come before, it's very tempting for me, especially my personality type as an ENFP, to go, damn the man, I'm going to storm the gates and we're going to do it our way this time around. And it's very tempting for me to not want to honor what has come before. And yet I realize that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, people that have come before, like the David Kierkegaard, for example, who really pushed forth typology in the 1980s through a very popular book, Please Understand Me, Please Understand Me Too. These have been people that have gone before to create some of the narratives and some of the ways that we even talk about typology now, which is really powerful.
Well, and an insane amount of research. I mean, most of the kids who are getting into typology right now, like the teens and 20-somethings, even a lot of 30-somethings, have absolutely no idea how much research has gone into typology and understanding typology on these various things, like elements of it. Man, there's so much research that has been done, particularly in the 90s. The 90s was a fantastic time for it. So was the 2000s. There are resources and links, and I can put a link to an extraordinary library of resources about research and type that a lot of kids who are just starting to learn it. I mean, there are some people who only know type based on what we've said, right? They learned about Myers-Briggs. They were looking for a podcast. They found the Personality Hacker podcast. They know cognitive functions. They know dichotomies. They know temperaments. They know everything they know because of our podcast alone. And they feel like it's a vast storehouse of knowledge, but the reality is that we barely scratched the surface here. There's so much resource. There is so much to learn in these libraries that people don't even know exist. And we, as podcasters, are standing on the shoulders of those giants. And so it's really tempting when you don't know all of that exists to go, oh, there's not a lot here. We need to reinvent the wheel. We need to reinvent all of this because nobody's really studied this before. When really there's I can't even express to you how much information's out there.
And it's always good to have people working on new theories, new ideas, new concepts, new ways of seeing stuff.
Fresh eyes.
Absolutely. And having said all that, I understand inside myself, I can feel that iconoclast that wants to push back. And yet I have to stop myself and go, there are people, like, for example, Dr. Beatrice Chestnut, who works with us, published the Enneagram Roadmap program. I was on Twitter recently talking a little bit about this, and I noticed a lot of people that were young people who, Beatrice has been doing this since 1990. Some of the people talking about this were born in the mid-90s, so half a decade after Beatrice started professionally working and learning the Enneagram and working with it in her psychotherapy practice. People that were born 5 to 10 years after her beginning to work with this, coming on and openly telling her or other people like her that are talking about the concepts that she's worked on for the last 3 decades that they're wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. And I was like, taken back by this. I was like, that's a little weird to push back against stuff that you don't have as much experience around. Not that you should just always defer to the experts. That's not what I'm trying to say. Because again, I can feel that iconoclast element inside me. I want to do that. I know the instinct is there. And yet I have to think about maturity and go, there's a lot that I don't know. And my opinion, just because I'm able to broadcast it, doesn't mean it's valid more than someone's 3 decades of using a typology system in the psychotherapy practice. Not that that's the end-all be-all just because someone spent 3 decades using typology in a psychotherapy practice and has written 2 books about it and teaches workshops all over the world. And yet, I think that there's got to be some value to that. Like, I can't just think my opinion's going to trump that person's experience. So again, I come back to this concept of experience, advice, knowledge, reference experiences, trump information, opinion, and just philosophies that you want to put forth. And I know we're harping on this first point a lot, but I think this is a fundamental key for us as content creators because it's so easy to create narrative without any training credentials. We can just spout forth on every platform under the planet. Here's my narrative. Here's how I think the world works. Here's how I think typology works. Here's how I think personal growth works. Here's how I think health and weight loss works. And it's so easy for us to do that. And yet there is a wealth of research and knowledge. There are people who have come before. There are experts in the world still, even though we are seeing a breakdown of not honoring them as much. There still are people that know what they're talking about stuff. And I believe we should look to that and go, you know what? I want to be the expert. I don't want to just combat them all the time.
I think, to go back to the point of this podcast, which is if you want to turn this into a career and if you want to turn this into the thing that you're doing, when you're going through the learning phase, it's important to not have hubris or overvalue what you think you figured out through observation. And when I say it's important to do that, I don't mean like ethically or morally important. Honestly, I don't care what you believe. You can believe whatever you want to. You can believe that you figured it all out in your bedroom, like having read some resources and watched some videos, and you're now the person who understands how all of this works. I don't care if you believe that. But if you are a person who wants to go on a trajectory of becoming, like cutting through the noise and actually turning this into a legit business, if you don't want to just be sort of, I don't know, like incestuous with a bunch of other people who feel the exact same way that you do and influence each other, like if you actually want to turn it into a trajectory of growth and into a career path or maybe even a business, this is part of how you cut through the noise, is having like sort of honoring and listening to and developing, and then, you know, the things that have come before, and then amalgamating them into real life experience to go from that knowledge to wisdom. And what ends up happening is, okay, and so like, you know, that whole concept that if you have a hammer, all the world's a nail. Well, right now, so we talked about Joel working with an energy coach before, and so now I'm working with the energy coach, and it's been really cool, and it's sort of reframing how I see everything. And one of the things, so you're probably on the podcast going to hear me harp a lot about energy because that's sort of the thing I'm fascinated with right now. But what I've noticed is that people respond to us more because of our energy than they do for our data. Like they like our information, people like our information, but what they like more is the energy that we're putting forth. And one of the elements of learning all of this content and data, all of this information is, and the reason why we're saying if you want to turn this into something that's legit, make sure that you're putting application to it and building wisdom, is that there's an energy that comes along with that. There's an energy that comes along with honoring what's become before and not just assuming you've got, you know, this hot take and this is the way that it works and then putting this out into the world. There's like a million people with that energy. Everybody's got that energy. It's so easy to have that postmodern, I'm the expert now energy. What you actually want is the energy of experience and authentic expertise. And people read that energy from you. They can just read it. And that's what they become attracted to. We're not the only people with a typology podcast. There's a ton of people out there that have within the time period that we started ours and have kept going, I think I've seen like half a dozen start, stop. And it's hard to do this and it's hard to get traction. Now, there's a couple of things that Joel and I have in our corner, which is that we both have public speaking experience. We both have been, you know, sort of Joel's been in radio. He's got some production elements to it. So there's like things like that. But quite honestly, I've noticed that people get attracted to energy more than they get attracted to anything else. So even if you don't, like in early days, we didn't have great production value, right? Like our production value was kind of meh. And we didn't have the same voices we have now. We had to kind of figure it out. There were time periods I listened to the podcast, you know, a few years ago and I kind of cringe. I'm like, oh yeah, that didn't sound that great. So, but people stuck with us. And I suspect it's part of the energy that we're bringing forth. So ultimately during this learning phase, it's a matter of finding the right energy, the right vibe. And part of the right vibe is not just assuming, not having hubris and just assuming you know what you're talking about. And that if you can articulate it well enough, then other people will see, oh, you have all this expertise. There's an energy that comes along with the restedness of not feeling insecure about your information. Because there's like almost like an insecurity that follows with not having vetted it in the quote unquote real world, not having applied the knowledge and information, like not having actually had a string of successes in coaching or even a string of some successes and some failures, and then being able to pick out the right lessons and pattern what went wrong and then reapply these, you know, do the test iterate that Joel is effectively talking about. There's a certain energy that comes along with having done that makes people attracted to you because you're projecting an air of authority. You're projecting an air of somebody who's figured some of this stuff out. And then that energy of authority, not just knowledge and information, but actual authority, That's what people usually are looking for. And then you'll cut through the noise. You'll be somebody that people want to follow because of the energy you're putting out.
So energy is going to be really important. I think I totally resonate with that. It's weird to me what state we're in, Antonia. We can have a podcast in a great state and not give out, like, it might have like some challenges with the podcast. Maybe the editing was wonky, or maybe we stumbled over our words. Maybe our ideas weren't as clear, and people respond really well to that. And then other times we'll put a lot of thought maybe into how we craft a podcast, but our energy isn't good. It's almost like the energy, I know this sounds super woo-woo, right? But the energy gets baked into the podcast in some way, and then we get like not as good a response, even though it was technically better. And we had all our words crafted well, and we said everything in the right exact way. I would agree with you. The more I go through life, the more I realize it's kind of the vibe you give out. And I've noticed that sometimes in writing, I get more of a response that's different than my speaking video or audio. In writing, it's very easy for me to be misunderstood or for people to misunderstand the energy I'm putting forth. But with speaking in video, audio, live events, it's not as misunderstood. I don't think energy can be taken out of context as easily as the words you use, right? Data can be taken out of context. Energy, it's hard to take energy out of context because that's actually what we're reading as humans. The subcommunication we're seeing from people when you show up on that camera as an influencer, how you look, how you behave, the way your eyes blink, the way you project your voice, the way you smile, your body language, all of that communicates way more than the actual words you use.
Yeah, and you're going to attract like.
Correct.
Like you're going to attract whatever energy you put out, you're going to attract those people back. I've noticed that there are there's some people who show up, and I'm not talking about in typology, I'm talking about just in general, like influencers and all sorts of niches. People project this judgy, know-it-all attitude, and they attract judgy, know-it-all people. And some people project this attitude of I'm right and you're wrong, and they attract people who think that they're right and everybody else is wrong. And then there's some people who, they don't have much to say, but their energy is so beautiful and serene and gorgeous. And then they attract a bunch of people who have like a lovely energy that don't want to go too deep. It's like people are looking for energies they vibe with and they can align with that reflect back to them their energy. So because of that, I mean, it's crazy, but we've noticed that even though we don't talk a lot about religion, we talk a little bit about our religious past and how we feel like we transcended what we needed to in our past. But what's crazy is that we attract a ton of people who are in a time period of graduating from whatever paradigm they had from youth, meaning,
or at least reevaluating.
Yeah, like they're reevaluating sort of their like the information that was given to them, their paradigms and perspectives. We don't harp on that much. And yet we still seem to attract a lot of people who are in that space in their life because of the energy, I suspect. And
we repel people who are against reevaluating those.
Yeah, exactly. We do repel, like people who are very set in their opinions. They don't like us very much. or what I've noticed sometimes happens is that people they write in to try to, because they might like us as individuals or whatever, or maybe they don't like us. Maybe they just want to set the record straight in the world. But they might reach out so that we'll see the error of our ways, and then when they find that we're not conducive to being proselytized in whatever their paradigm is, and I'm not just talking about religious people. I'm talking about people of all different paradigms. When they try to sort of help us see the error of our ways so that we'll follow their worldview, then they're incredibly frustrated when we don't. And then they like sort of abandon us, or they like go, oh, this is a sinking ship, or you guys will never get anywhere. And it's like, okay, well, we're just sort of in this energetic space of being more open. And so we repel people who need to believe their worldview as strongly as they do without reevaluation. Our energy does not mix well with their energy. And that's what's so interesting about energy is it almost doesn't matter what the conversation is. I've had people who were strong activists. I've had people who were strong Christians. I've had people who were just, strong agnostics or atheists, or people who believed that we were talking about something we should have been talking about because this is actually the right way of looking at it. We've had, when we talked about energy work, I got a long email from somebody who talked about how terrible energy work was. It's like, like those people might even stick around to some extent and stay attracted to some extent, but that energy, like those moments when they hear something that is not gelling with them, man, there's such an energetic discord. So this concept of energy is really important in the learning piece. When you want to be an influencer, you have to think as much about the quality of character that you are as a person and the kind of person that you want to attract in order to showcase that element of yourself. Not just the data, not just the information, but also infusing, like you said, Joel, baking in your energy into the content that you're creating. And then recognizing that you're going to attract people who are similar to you. You're going to attract, like if you're attracting a bunch of people who are bickering and fighting all the time, maybe in your community or underneath all of your content, you see just comment after comment of just negativity. I mean, YouTube comments used to be just generally negative until they improved them. So I'm not talking about in all platforms necessarily, but most of the platforms, people, there's a mixed bag of positive and negative. But if you're seeing overwhelmingly negative responses, then you probably bake that into your or your energy was baked into the content you created. So is there a way to come at it from a more positive perspective? Or do you want to have mostly negative? Do you want to whip people up and have people feel that way? Is that your end game? But in the learning piece, understanding that wisdom is the bigger piece and understanding that people are looking for advice and they're looking for somebody who has a voice of wisdom that they can rest into, somebody who's applied this, feels very secure and set, and then also is putting out an energy of what they're attempting to have as an end game. If your energy, like our energy is, we're attempting to do is have an energy of honesty, transparency, sincerity, and one of always trying harder the next time. Like that's what we're always trying to do. We're always trying to try harder. We're trying to get to a really good place in our personal growth and development, and we try to put that energy into our podcast. And so we have a tendency to attract people who are in a place where they're like reevaluating and going, yeah, I want my life to be better too. I want to keep trying harder. I want to keep trying to make steps and improve. And so it kind of doesn't matter that we're talking about type, if that makes sense. Like type is just sort of that's the not a smokescreen, but type is just the vehicle or the way that we're smuggling in all of this energy around keep going, keep getting to the next phase. You can do this. If you're in a transition point in your life, it's going to be fine. That's really what we're articulating. Well, we're articulating type, but we're communicating that energy. So think about what you're communicating and think about the way you're articulating. And I think it's the combination of those two things that attracts the right audience.
Yeah, and again, remember we're talking about the framework of value exchange for being an influencer. Whether you have advertising, direct monetary value exchange, some type of a value creation, value exchange framework as an influencer. Obviously, anyone has the ability to kick on a mic, a camera, stand on a stage and talk, but value exchange is something a little different. So talking about value exchange, the next point is know what the value is that you're adding. What value do you bring to the table? And I would start to posit to you, and we can talk about this more on future podcasts around maybe money and business and careers, transition your language from money and resource to value, because really that's all money is. It's captured value in some way. And some of the wealthiest people on the planet do not keep their value in actual money. They keep it in their assets, the things they own, the relationships they have. They get paid very little as far as actual like salary, for example, or actual cash, because that's just one form of value exchange or value capture. And if you're sophisticated in wealth creation or thinking in terms of, wealth building, things of that nature, you transition from money to value, and value is really where it's at. So in the framework of value creation and value exchange, which can derive, can throw out money from it, but thinking of value, what is your value? Where do you come to the table with the value add that you have? One thing that we've talked about recently on the Message Your Message podcast a few weeks ago is this little model we came up with called Visionary, Calibrator, Implementer. And, visionary is someone that can see down the road the vision of what needs to happen. The implementer is someone that can help make that vision happen, like can actually execute on the day-to-day tasks or projects. And then a calibrator is someone that can keep it from drifting, keep it on course, keep it from going off the rails, keep hold the framework for where you're heading with all of it. And just that little framework, for example, can help you to identify where your value add is. Are you more of a visionary person? Are you helping create a vision, casting a narrative in a visionary way to help people see a better future? Are you helping give them the steps to execute, kind of like this podcast, giving you step-by-step kind of ways to think about stuff? Or maybe this is more of a calibration podcast, quite frankly, I would think, if I'm honest with myself. Or are you calibrating, kind of like what this podcast is, giving more of the, hey, here's maybe how to reframe thinking about this. Don't think about money, think about value instead of money, which I think is what I just did. So this podcast is probably a calibrative podcast, not an integrative as much and not a visionary. And just knowing kind of where your value add is in that and identifying it can be very powerful for you when you show up. How do I normally show up to the world? When I get on that camera, behind that microphone, step on that stage, which value am I giving in some of these ways?
In that particular podcast, we did call it integrator. We called it visionary, calibrator, integrator. We're changing the word from integrator to implementer because we think it's more clear. Some people are like, what does integrator mean?
Yeah.
And it originally comes from a book that mentions...
Traction.
Yeah, the book Traction that mentions this idea of visionary and integrator. And we, in the Message Your Message thing podcast, we talked a little bit about how we realized that there's actually a third component of calibrator. In this particular niche, I don't even want to call it an industry yet, but in this particular niche that is growing into an industry, there's a lot of calibrators. A lot of us are calibrated. I'm a calibrator, right? That's my primary. And I think it's very common for people to put out content that is calibrated content. Think about it this way. It's not quite like that. It's more like this. And I think a lot of the, when we talk about people who don't know that there's a lot of information out there and they're just sort of sitting around and thinking about it themselves, most of them have calibrator minds. They're thinking about it in terms like they're really going deep and thinking about it really deeply and going, what maybe is a better way to think about this? There is value in that, by the way. Like there's a lot of people who have come to these kinds of concepts with fresh eyes, with fresh calibrator minds, who are figuring things out that maybe previous people didn't figure out. The element that they might be forgetting is the importance of implementation. So when we talk about go out and actually see if this works in the outside world, what we're saying is don't forget the importance of test iterating and implementation. Now, I have a tendency to do that. I have a tendency to forget the importance of that until I'm in a context that forces me to do it, and then I remember how important that is, particularly to recalibrate after I've implemented. So implementation is a fantastic way to test, iterate, and then once you've implemented, you go back and you go, okay, what did I get wrong in my calibration? What did I assume was how that worked? And then it ended up working differently than I thought. And now I have a much cleaner, more calibrated way of looking at it. So when Joel talks about what is your value, I think what it is recognizing that you can be one of these three things. Each one brings high value to it. A lot of us in this world are calibrators, and that's the value that we bring. And the challenge is that this niche is overrun with calibrators. Most of us are calibrators. And so because most of us are, we have to figure out what our value is in a host of, sort of in a world of people just like us. How do we set ourselves apart? Is it just that we're talking about type in a different way? Or is that we've also been able to say maybe cast a vision for people and how they can use it? Or maybe we've figured out some implementation. We've done our own test iterate. And so now we're able to give the advice of how other people can implement this in their lives. So figuring out our value is not just identifying where we're at, but also some of the blind spots and where we fit in this whole little pond that we're talking about.
So it's knowing where you stand here value-wise, but also knowing how the value you bring is translated into value exchange. So that's not necessarily obvious, right? There's some elements to this where, quote unquote, you should be value exchanged for the things you bring to the table. I think we all kind of feel that way sometimes. And yet there's the reality of actually making the value exchange happen. So what do I mean by that? So for example, an implementer framework of 10 steps to losing weight and feeling healthy, losing your belly fat and feeling healthy. That's a very implementer way of going. Now, there might be some calibration in that, like you should calibrate from eating sugar to not eating sugar. But the implementer that comes with that idea, the 10 steps, is creating a pathway to get a result. And that's very obvious to me, and I think you probably listening, of how that could be transitioned into value exchange. You have 10 steps to X result. You create that in the world as an influencer, and there's an obvious exchange for that path for the value back for getting that result the person wants. That's probably the most obvious of all of them. When you get into visionary, casting a vision of what people can be, that's more of the inspiration element of things. Hey, look at what you could do. I want to inspire you to something greater. Sometimes it's hard to connect that to value exchange because people can feel inspired in all sorts of ways. And it's not as clear to people. It's not a one-to-one connection of the inspiration or the vision you're casting for them of what they could be or how they can see things into the future for the value exchange to be obvious. So the work is a little more difficult to help someone understand the value exchange of what you provide if you're a visionary person. If you're an influencer that's casting visions in the world, there's a little bit more of a challenge of connecting that to value exchange. And the other thing is typically visions, because it's about what's coming down the road, and it's casting forth some philosophy and some narrative of what you want to see also as the visionary, kind of how you want the world to be, or at least how you could see it being. It tends to be political, not like political like Republican, Democrat, or anything like that, but political in that it brings up a lot of people's disagreements about how the world should look in the future, because all of us have our own ideas about that. So it's a little treacherous sometimes in the attacks you might get and also how to transition that into value exchange. And then we come to the Calibrator side, which is more about helping people make those nuanced tweaks in their life to reframe things and make their life better. So it's a lot of coaches, for example, are calibrators, one-to-one coaches. I'm sure that Tiger Woods, the famous golf player, I'm sure his golf coach is probably a calibrator, probably helping him go, hey, if you turn your club a slight angle this way, it's going to make the ball go more straight and further in your golf game. So it's constant calibration on his golf game to make him better. I'm sure like Olympic trainers, people that are training like the gymnasts in the Olympics, are helping them calibrate. Hey, on the balance beam, if you put your left wrist down, I don't know how it works, but like you put this wrist down this way, when you flip and do your cartwheel, it's going to help you flip faster and better and more precision. So a lot of calibrators end up being coaches, one-to-one coaches. And again, it's sometimes hard to transition the value exchange in people's minds of what you're providing them for a value exchange, because it's not as obvious to them how you're benefiting them, right? The most obvious is implementer. And I would say probably the next obvious is calibrator, and the least obvious is visionary, of how to connect these and make value exchange from them. So if you're a calibrator, which a lot of people in our audience, a lot of people listening, so you're probably one of these people, is probably thinking in terms of calibration. How do you go from maybe a one-to-one coaching experience and amplify that to more people when you're an influencer? And that's something that we've done a lot of work on here. Antonia is a natural calibrator, a fantastic coach. If you ever get personal coaching from her, it will change your life. She doesn't do a lot of coaching right now because we're so busy taking the coaching that she's been doing a lot of years, and we're broadcasting that coaching in a lot of ways. We're helping connect that to a wider audience. Right? I tend to be more of a visionary. So neither one of us are necessarily implementers. I have visions of how I want to see typology, personal growth. And part of building this company is taking some of those visions and connecting them. This podcast is, in a lot of ways, also not just a calibrative podcast, but it's a visionary podcast to say, if you want to be an influencer, this is how it could look. This is a vision for you as a person that wants to be on a platform to speak truth in the world, or speak your narrative in the world and cast that narrative and see something different. Here's how that could look, and here's some steps you could think about.
We'd be further along if either of us was implementers first.
Right?
Like be
millionaires maybe, I don't know.
Like if you look at in this world, in our particular niche, the number one company I think of when I think of implementers in this is 16 Personalities. I don't think they're calibrators, and I don't think they're visionaries. They are just 100% implementers, and they're killing it. Everybody knows about 16 Personalities. It drives people crazy that they're the number one name, and that anybody who knows anything about Myers-Briggs, like at the most surface level, has gone to 16 Personalities. And I think it's just because they're implementers. They just get it done. And for us, we want to calibrate everything, and we've got this big vision for how we want it to look, and so we end up not getting as far along because the implementer part is where we struggle. We know what we want, and we can calibrate on the way, but sometimes we don't know how to do it. So yeah, understanding the value exchange piece there too is good, because actually implementers, like you said, implementers are the ones who have the most obvious value. And you can see a lot of the influencers right now, they're integrator calibrators, because they have a calibrative mind around type to some extent, but mostly they're implementers because they're just getting it done, regardless of how they have to do it. They just kick on their microphones or kick on their cameras, and they're just uploading content like crazy. Most of the people coming up have an integrative mind. And so a lot of times actually what they're missing is a visionary mind, because they're not sure where to take it. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing. They just feel compelled to do it. And so oftentimes the visionary, which is the one that's the hardest to understand their value, is actually one of the most valuable because it gives people something to go towards. And so in this world right now, I would say visionaries are the key to the whole operation, which is why I think we're where we're at, Joel, because you're a visionary. And so we've done things, even though neither of us are implementers first, we've done things that I think other people maybe didn't think about doing because you've got a vision for where we want to be going. And I've bought into your vision. I'm like, yep, let's go. And then as we go, I calibrate, as we get there. So that, again, to bring it back to what you're talking about, which is value exchange, understanding which component that you might be missing and understanding what you bring to the table, understanding what you bring to the table in relationship to the rest of the community, and then making sure that you understand that you're not just looking for a dollar bill to our piece, right? You're looking for a way to give value that can't be ignored, and then people want to reciprocate by giving value back. I can't tell you how many people have asked us if we have a donate button. Like they don't buy our products or programs necessarily. They just want to give us money because they've gotten value from the podcast. And we've thought about it. I mean, I think we've been talking about this for 2 years, putting up like a Patreon or something to that effect. And I've been hesitant because I'm like, well, if somebody's going to give us value back, I want them to get even more value. I want them to get a program, right? I want them to get something of value back. But I think people feel compelled to reciprocate from the podcast alone. And that shows that something that we're doing is giving people enough value where they want to give value back. And it's just an example. I mean, we're talking about ourselves because that's the number one experience what we have. It's our frame of reference. But it shows that when you give enough value out and people really feel it, there's a sense of reciprocity that gets sort of, gets stirred up in them. And then they want to give you value for the value that they've received.
Also, when we're talking about you being an influencer, in a lot of ways, and this is something we learned in the last 6 to 8 years, because, well, we learned that you are the product, basically, in a lot of ways. When I say product, I don't mean you're a product. You're not like a physical object. But in a lot of ways, what you're creating value around and what you're, quote unquote, selling is yourself, who you are as a star, as an influencer. That's part of what it is. I think in the early days, we thought we could build this company and put a lot of information out there and advice and things and not have to be out in front of it all and be the faces of all that. And it became very clear to us that in a lot of ways, people were coming around and doing value exchange to be connected to us as people. And I think influencers, this is something that influencers are going to have to think in terms of, is that you are, in a lot of ways, and I don't think if you want to be an influencer, it's going to be lost on you. In fact, you might love this aspect, but in a lot of ways, you are the product. You are the thing that you are putting out as the value itself. So that's a holistic framework. So you might be really great on topic A. Let's say you're into weight loss and those things, but if you're not working on all aspects of your life, that means that your quote unquote product is going to suffer. And the better your product is, the better the value exchange can be. So how well-rounded are you in other areas? How many other aspects of your life do you have dialed in? And are some of those things harming you? I mean, for us, for example, physical health and diet is probably one of the biggest struggles, at least for me, I think probably for you too, Antonia, that we deal with. Routine, physical health, and diet. Like eating healthy and being physical and exercising. We're in our heads a lot. We're cerebral. We're intuitive. We want to be doing creative things all the time. The last thing I want to do is stop and go to the gym during the day or go do yoga. And yet when I do that, I feel really empowered. It helps my stress levels. It helps me be a better quote unquote product for the other areas of my life that I show up that is on camera. So off camera, I'm doing these things, or off microphone, I'm doing these things to build up my health and my physical strength and my discipline. And that only helps me be a better influencer in the things I do talk about. I don't talk about health and wellness at all. And yet that helps me talk about personality types and personal growth because, again, I see it as I am the product in some ways. And you as an influencer, I think you can frame yourself to start seeing it this way as well.
I hated this thing that you're talking about, making peace with it. I hated it. In the early days, I wanted it to be, we talked about having a sellable asset. So we'd build this business enough so that it could be sold, to somebody else. And that if we put anything too personal on any of this, then, we couldn't do that because we were the asset. So what we're going to do is sell ourselves to, another person as a company or whatever. But when we started realizing that we were the product, like you're talking about, our success it almost started like creating a hockey stick, right? That whole concept of the exponential growth curve. Like it started becoming so apparent to us that this is how that worked. And I think that would be the case even if we weren't putting ourselves in the forefront. Like we're not the Joel and Antonia show. We're Personality Hacker, right? And it's Personality Hacker with Joel and Antonia. I wanted to think that we were swappable pieces. I wanted to believe that Personality Hacker could live after us if somebody else could basically do our job. But I got to a point where I realized that, no, I don't think that that's accurate. I think that we are an integral part of all of this. And I think the reason why I was resisting that was twofold. Number one, I was just, I'm a sexual dominant. So I'm just kind of uncomfortable with the idea of broadcasting in general. And
in the Enneagram system.
In the Enneagram system. I'm a Enneagram Sexual 3. And I'm a social blind. And if you want to know what that means, like go check out the Enneagram podcast that we did with Beatrice Chestnut before. As a social blind, I don't really like the idea of broadcasting myself. It's very uncomfortable to me. That was the first one. And that's kind of understandable. And I had to make peace with it. And I had to integrate my blind spot. But the second thing is I knew how responsible I'd be to it. Like you mentioned, the last thing I want to do is have to focus on my physical health. And the more video we were recording, the more I was like, I should probably take care of this. Now, I also wanted to take care of it because I don't want to, have hip replacement surgery in my 70s because I've allowed myself to, be overweight my entire life and have all the, the things that come along with that I've noticed that happens to the women in my family when they've been overweight their whole lives. I didn't want any of those things to have, I didn't want to have to contend with those things like knee replacement surgery, that sort of thing. But also I realized that I couldn't really tell people that they need to continue to improve themselves if I was unwilling to look at this aspect of my life and do self-improvement there, if I was unwilling to be disciplined there. So now I've actually got a very healthy routine in place and I feel 10 times better. And also it's in part because I knew I was responsible to the audience that I was making these statements to. And so I think as an influencer, there's benefit to realizing that quote, you're the quote unquote product. And that is that you're then responsible to the content that you're putting out there. You as a person, as a character, needs to be as good as the messages that you're giving to other people, because otherwise you're that's hypocrisy. And I just didn't want to be a hypocrite anymore. So, and that includes all areas of life. Now, it could be one of those things where you just do one thing at a time. You can't necessarily be all things to all people simultaneously. So I wanted to get certain aspects of my life handled, and then I'd move on to the next. Right now, I've kind of got this whole health thing dialed in, and now I'm moving on to organizing our lives. Our lives need to be more routinized. They need to be more of a schedule. We're organizing our lives more. That's the next thing that we're moving on to. So I'm not saying that you have to do everything simultaneously, and you have to keep improving if that's the message you're giving to your audience. So that's part of the value. Part of the value is that you improve yourself. Part of the value is that you stay in alignment and congruity with the messaging that you're giving to your audience. And that energy will let them know whether or not you're doing that. If you're coming with bad energy, they'll know you're a hypocrite, and they'll get turned off and they'll stop listening to you. If you're coming with good positive energy and you're coming with something that indicates you are congruent with your messaging, that's high value. It's hard to find that. It is hard to find people that you can tell are sincere and in alignment with their messages. And now you stand, it doesn't matter whether you're a calibrator, visionary, or an implementer, you stand apart from the crowd, and people will be attracted to the things you're saying because they can tell that it's actually worked on you. You're actually living it. It's a good enough thing. It's a good enough message to not just be a platitude or a soundbite, but actually be a lifestyle or a way of life.
So we talked about in this learning framework, again, you can put yourself out there as an influencer. You can even start creating, which I recommend you do. And we'll talk a little about that next when we talk about create and broadcast. But there's a learning element to this. There's kind of the getting started part. And depending on where you're at in your influencer career, a lot of people are at this stage where they're learning and they're getting some experience under their belt. Again, experience and advice trump opinion and information. knowing the value you add and how you can transition that value into a value exchange is key. And then finally in the learning frame is I recommend working for free to get some more experience and to learn about what you're doing as an influencer. Now, I want to make a caution here and say maybe. there's a parenthetical work for free and in parenthesis maybe. If you don't have any direction necessarily of where you want to go as an influencer, and you're just working for free and spinning your wheels and writing blog posts for free all over the place and creating videos for free and contributing without any kind of value exchange at all, I recommend you don't do that unless you have a little bit of a plan of where you're headed. So when I say work for free, I know there's a lot of complaints right now about people that are expected to have some kind of expertise or influencer abilities to just put themselves out there for free indefinitely for big companies that exploit them. I don't think that's a good idea. That's not what I'm trying to say here.
Or even small companies that give you promises of exposure. It's like, this will be great for your portfolio. And the small company is just looking for really cheap labor or free labor.
Exactly. So if you're doing it for exposure, or if you're doing it to hopefully get noticed and put on, now again, if that's your strategy, that's fine. But if you're doing it for exposure, I don't know if that's going to be the best way to go about it as far as I would see influencers in the world. I think that learning should be the frame. Again, this is the learning category, right? If you're learning things while you do it, then it's invaluable. It's just, the value can't be placed on it because that experience, that learning is so powerful and you have to have it to be able to speak with authority as you create in the next category. So doing some things for free can be really beneficial. And I think that this is something that it's very nuanced when I say that. I don't mean do everything for free, but I do mean do some things for free. Give value before you request it back to you.
To give an example of what Joel is talking about, he just said that I'm like this great coach, which I may or may not be a great coach. I don't know if it's a game-changing opportunity to coach with me. I'm not sure if I necessarily believe that, but I do think I'm a pretty solid one. And it comes after years of experience, and it started with me doing it for free. It started with me coaching for a whole year, actually. I worked with another coach who was an established coach, and I was a value add for him, meaning that he would sell his coaching package to his clients, and part of the bonuses or the value add is that they got sessions with me around personality development and typology. It's where I learned how to profile. I would profile people during that entire year, many times. I sort of crafted my profiling skills during that. And then after that, I would give them advice based on their personality type, and I would see how it would work out. And when I first started, I was very clumsy. I was kind of a terrible coach. I did things like I did too much talking and I didn't let them talk enough. I did too many statements and not enough questions. I just made a lot of beginner mistakes in coaching. And then after I did it for about a year and figured out all the mistakes I was making and got a lot of feedback on the things that I wasn't doing well, because again, this was free. It was a value add. It was a bonus. And so people didn't feel like if I quote unquote wasn't the most stellar coach, it was okay because they didn't pay for the service. But it gave me a ton of experience. And by the end of the year, I felt, okay, I think I'm ready for this. And then I started charging after that. Once I felt very confident and capable, then I started doing it. But like you mentioned, Joel, I had a vision for it. Like I knew where I was headed. I knew I was headed to paid gigs.
You knew what you wanted to learn.
That's right. Exactly. I knew what I was trying to learn. So I think that whole concept of work for free, maybe work for free if you know why you're working for free. If there's like a specific reason for it that you're building up towards. If you're just working for free because you're hoping it will give you an opportunity, I wouldn't say do that. But if you're doing it for yourself, then yeah, I mean that's the thing about being in this world is that you're gonna do a lot of stuff that isn't paid labor. You're going to do a lot of throwing spaghetti against the walls. You're gonna do a lot of spinning your wheels. You're gonna do a lot of like energy expenditure that goes nowhere. You know, especially if you're building a business. My God, that's the one. I mean, if you want to see a lot of wasted effort, start your own business and figure it all out as you go. And there's value in that because you learn, and then eventually you're not spinning your wheels anymore. Eventually, the return on investment is really high, but it's got to be an investment.
I would say that it's okay, like from my standpoint, it really kind of depends on the type of person you are. I would have no problem with myself working for free. Just I've done this. I mean, I think I counted up to like 17 failed business attempts in like my entire life before Personality Hacker. Either failed or they didn't go anywhere. I shut them down because it wasn't turning out the way I wanted it to. And I have no problem throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks, metaphorically, because I know that I won't have resentment in myself. I won't turn quote unquote wasted effort into resentment. I always quote unquote turn wasted effort into learning. That's the framework I come from. So if you're able to alchemize any experience into reference experience and learning, by all means, create as much for free for as many entities as you can, because you're getting that valuable learning. But if you fear that you might resent that later, making that choice because you expected to have some kind of return on that necessarily, like a direct return, I would caution you not to give away your work for free, because all you're going to do is build up more resentment in yourself, which stops you from being able to do what you want to do. So it really depends on how you're wired, how you approach it. We've talked about a lot of different things here just in the learning piece out of the three phases.
We keep doing this. We keep like going, hey, well, let's record a podcast on this topic. And then we just talk and talk and talk.
I think it's cool because we're able to riff on some of the concepts, some of the key points, and give examples and some nuance to them. But I think we need to split this up into some multiple parts here.
I agree.
So let's wrap this up for today. And let's pick up on the next show, on the next episode, the creation phase of being an influencer, and we'll talk more about actually creating and some of the things to think about there now that we've got some of the baseline underpinnings laid down of how to learn and think about prepping yourself to be an influencer online. And we want to hear from you. Are you currently an influencer in some topic, in some avenue? Do you have a channel or channels online where you influence people? You give your perspective, you cast a narrative into the world around. It doesn't have to be typology, it can be any topic, quite frankly. What's your experience? Are some of the things we're seeing resonating with you? What's worked? What hasn't worked? Where have you had your learning experience come through?
Well, and I mean, I know you're about to say, invite people to come tell us their story. I just wanted to say really quick before we do that, again, I think a big piece of what we're talking about here in the learning phase is because we harped a little bit about honoring people, who came before, and not just sharing what you've learned with other people, but also, alchemizing it into some wisdom and applied advice. And I think for me, what got flayed out of this conversation that was, in my opinion, some of the most important is, who are you as a person that is going to put yourself in a position to be an influencer? Like, what kind of person are you, and are you attending to that? Are you making sure that you're putting out the right energy into the world? And so to loop back to something that we talked about earlier in the podcast, which is, even if you're not an influencer, even if you're just somebody who is, that concept of laborer, the knowledge worker, the creative worker, and sort of that sort of ladder that we've been creating for ourselves in the last 100 years, then I think that the same things apply to the person who's simply trying to put themselves out there in order to get whatever kind of position, career, or whatever. The energy that you're putting out into the world is also going to be returned to you in those contexts as well. So as a person who's looking for a job, are you also thinking, what's the quality of character that I'm presenting to potential employees? What's the quality of character that I'm infusing into things that I'm using to advertise about myself, like my resume, my CV, or any other more creative way of getting attention for who you are? So remember, it's a matter of attending and addressing to yourself as a person who's a learner before you put yourself out into the world, and then hope that the world gives you the same energy that you're giving back. If you're giving really great juju, great energy, you're probably going to feel that returned no matter what you're trying to put out there, whether it's an influencer network or whether it's just trying to land that job.
I think it's well put. And I think the value you bring to the world may not be obvious to you even, but reflecting upon that, regardless of your career, your status, where you are, and knowing where your basic value, like how you're wired, and then amplifying that. Often when somebody comes to work with us, one of the questions I ask them is, what's your superpower? Like, what do you mean by superpower? Like, what is it? What does you do well? What's the value you bring to the world? What's the superpower you bring? And often that person will mention something that may not be job related specifically. But what I'm looking for when I ask them that is, do they understand the value they bring, how they create value in the world? And people that understand that and have multiple avenues for creating value and understand how to transition that into value exchange. Here's the value I bring. Here's my superpower. Here's how I transition that into value back to myself. People that know that typically go very far in life because they understand how to apply that value and create opportunity for themselves. So I think that's very, very well said, Antonia, for any endeavor you're on about or after. We do want to hear from you, though. Come over to personalityhacker.com, directly below this show in the comment field. Ask your questions, leave your feedback or comments, share your story. Let us know how this is resonating with you. Are you looking to be an influencer? Are you struggling? Have you gotten some traction? We want to hear from you about your story and about some of the things you're seeing out there in the wild, the actual experiences that you're having. Because we can sit here and talk on these microphones, but we want to hear your voice, and you don't have a mic with you right now. So come over to personalityhacker.com and leave your feedback.
Yeah, you're the ones who, in this context, oftentimes give us the wisdom because you're talking about how you've applied the things we've talked about and how it's panned out for you. So you're the wisdom that we get to all of us get to benefit from. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. Go get a copy of our book, Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. You can get it online at Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. And also, if you want to special order it at your local bookstore, we think that would be super cool. If you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads or any other platform where you can leave book reviews, that would also help us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll continue this discussion on the next episode of the Personality Hacker Podcast.